So my name is Kelly Rovegno, and I'm the University Archivist here at USU. So that just means I oversee the records of the university. I also oversee our reading room, so welcoming patrons in and making sure they get our materials. And of course, Old Ephraim is one of our most popular items, so he's part of that. We are located in the basement, or the garden level, if you want to be polite, of the Merrill Kazir Library at Utah State University. I'm originally from Seattle. I worked at the University of Washington as a student in their libraries, and so I've always kind of wanted to go into libraries, and I ended up working a few jobs in the Northwest, but I wanted to work in academia, so kind of have to move around a bit, so I've been here for about 4 years as the University Archivist.
Okay, and what has been kind of your favorite thing about working here, or what's one of the coolest things you like to show?
I always like the variety of stuff at, in a university. We're an ag school, so we kind of have a lot of cool kind of like farming history. This year is actually the 50th anniversary of the St. Croix sheep. Some of my colleagues are less excited, but there is a little kind of celebration in September here for that. But this is the variety of history. You're always learning new things about Utah State. There was actually one of our early presidents, President Whitso. He met some Persian nobility at a dry farming conference in Alberta, Canada, in the early 1900s, and he ended up inviting him to give a speech, and so that kind of started an early relationship with USU and Iran that continues to this day. But I guess the topography around Tehran and northern Utah is very similar, so you kind of have that connection. We have some various presidential signatures. Our presidents were writing to, the U.S. presidents for various reasons, whether it be kind of land grant colleges or condolences after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. So in that aspect, you just get a lot of really neat university history. People often ask, what's my favorite item? It's actually the first seal of the university was commissioned early on, and they wanted it to kind of have the Greek goddess of agriculture holding some items, and so they commissioned it out of Salt Lake, and when it arrived, it was apparently not to standards. There was some controversy over that, and it's described in a letter. Like, he wrote to the maker and was complaining about the image, and so for many years we didn't actually have it, but then it was found while excavating, I believe, near Old Main Hill, and so the leading theory is it was thrown in the dirt in frustration, and it's a little amateurish, but that's just my opinion. Some people really like it, but another one was later commissioned. So kind of this, this history. There's the Beano Club, which was an early kind of student club at USU, and there's all these stories about them like greasing the trolley tracks that used to run up to the university. Whether that happened, there's less evidence, but there's some good stories. I always like to tell people that they didn't apparently build drains when they first commissioned Old Main, and so students were pouring acid out the windows, or they didn't have bathrooms, which caused a scandal because a woman faculty member kept seeing men's knees, so she had a separate gymnasium built. So, and then of course we have 8 curatorial areas, and also we have a lot of rare books, some medieval manuscripts that we use for our students. We have a lot of materials we have for instruction. We have the second largest Jack London collection in the U.S. outside the Huntington Library. We have a very large government information collection that we've been a depository library since pretty early on in that program, so a lot of ag history too. We have our newest one is the Outdoor Product Archive, so that is with Clint Pumphrey, who's both our manuscript curator and the curator over that collection, and it includes a lot of early outdoor product catalogs, so you get some fascinating stuff with that too.
And what were you saying about the sheep?
Oh yeah, so in the 1970s, Dr. Warren Foote, who worked at USU as a faculty member in ag, he technically wasn't the first gentleman to bring this sheep breed called the St. Croix to the U.S., but he was one of the earliest, and it's a hair sheep, and it's used in meat production, and kind of does well in kind of the what you'd find in Utah with a lot of brush, pretty hardy breed. So he brought it here and did kind of the early breed experiments, and it's, from what I gather, a relatively popular heritage breed these days. But it's the 50th anniversary since the importation of those St. Croix sheep, and so just stuff like that. Since we are an ag school, we have some connections that you wouldn't think to kind of the broader national scene of ag. So there's always something exciting.
What can you tell us about Old Ephraim?
So I can kind of go through. Old Ephraim, to start, is allegedly one of the last grizzly bears in the state of Utah. There's a lot of stories around him, and if you listen to any of the kind of retellings, you'll hear different things, kind of different facts, even like what year it took place in. There's been like some say it took place in 1922, others in 1923. So what is myth and what's reality can get a little jumbled. But he was at least one of the last grizzly bears in Utah, and so he lived in Logan Canyon. At the time, there was a lot of sheep grazing, and so kind of predators were coming into conflict with the farmers and the herders because there was less and less, essentially things for them, these predators to eat, and so they're preying on the sheep. And so Frank Clark was a local herder, and he had been kind of chasing Old Ephraim. He said for 9 years, whether it was the same bear, give or take. So he ended up kind of on this hunt for Old Ephraim, and eventually he cornered him. He got him trapped in a bear trap. How much that trap weighed is another of those historical facts that's a little unclear. It's either between like 20 and 80 pounds. So he caught Old Ephraim in this trap, and Old Ephraim was, according to Frank Clark, this very old and strong grizzly bear, and so he was able to rear up on his hind legs and kind of chase Frank Clark for a bit with this trap, and he also had a log chain on another leg, and Frank Clark was able to kill him after shooting him several times, including in the head, which is why if you come see our skull, it is partial. It was also burned after, so there's for that. And so once he'd kind of dispatched Old Ephraim, he burned the body, and then word kind of got around. And according to Frank Clark, he was this huge grizzly bear. Kind of their traditional size is like 9 foot 11 inches. Some say as high as 13. We ended up sending the measurements some years ago to one of the grizzly bear research centers in Montana, and they said he was probably only like 7 feet. 550 pounds. He was a big bear, but perhaps not as big as legend suggests. And so he was buried up in the canyon. There's a grave marker that was erected there in the 1960s that you can still go up and see. But the local Boy Scouts, Troop Number 5, wanted to go kind of see where he had died and been buried, and so they went up there. They dug him up and brought him back. I've heard some legends of them bringing back various pieces, including like a femur that got turned into a pipe. But I've never actually seen any of this, so who knows? There may be someone in Logan who has a grizzly bear pipe in their garage. But as far as we know, the skull is the only remaining piece of him that at least we have. So he was brought back. They dried and cleaned the skull, and then because he was kind of like this legend of the West, they ended up sending him to the Smithsonian in the early 20s. And from what I understand, he was actually on display in the Smithsonian, but probably not that long, a year or two at most. But I don't think the Smithsonian ever told the people back in Cache Valley that they had the skull, it just wasn't on display. And so in the 70s, some Boy Scouts went to go see it, and it wasn't on display. And so Orrin Hatch, who was a long-sitting senator, he was he had just become the junior senator then. He kind of wanted, to make some goodwill, and so he got the Smithsonian to loan it to us originally for a year. So he returned it. It was very quite the event. He landed on the quad with a helicopter. And then returned the skull, and USC was very excited to have the skull, but they were like, eventually like, where are we gonna, house this skull, because we want it on display, which was the original issue. So it was on display in the Spectrum. It was like in a parade, but it quickly soon ended up with us, and so it's been on display in special collections ever since.
All right, and since you've been here, like, you obviously know the story really well. Like, is it one of those items that everybody asks about, or like, what's kind of been your experience with housing that?
Oh yeah, it's certainly one of our most popular items, right? Because even if people aren't familiar with, we have a lot of other material about northern Utah, but people usually, if they're from around here, they know about Old Ephraim, even if they're not. I've heard people say, if they're from California and they've heard reenactors tell the story, so he's pretty well known, I think, at least in the West. And certainly if you walk into our reading room, people wonder, like, why is there a partial bear skull on display? What happened? The question, what happened to the rest of him, is certainly one I get often. So he's certainly, I'd say, our most well-known item. And we've tried to put him on display so that we're only open certain hours, but you can see him anytime the library is open, even if you have not access to our reading room. And we certainly do a lot because people, from anywhere from young children, grade schoolers, through adults, kind of want to hear the story of Old Ephraim and see the original skull.
And do you know anything about the process of how it was stored or
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm certainly not an expert on how it was stored, but if you kind of film up close to the skull, you'll kind of see he's a little waxy. I usually tell grade schoolers that he was glazed like a donut. But you can imagine he had been buried and burned, and then kind of dried out in a scout leader's garage in the 20s. So when he was at the Smithsonian, we're not quite sure what was done to him, but we assume a wax resin was put on the skull to keep it in place, and kind of from flaking apart. I have not touched the skull, but I've been told it's a little slimy because of that. When you work in kind of historical preservation, we're trying not to change anything too much. And so we just kind of have him in display, protect him. If you see the skull, you'll see tags and numbers. Those were by the Smithsonian. And technically they still own it. It's on permanent loan to us. They call every few years and ask if we still have the skull, and we still do. But because it was coated in kind of that protective layer and is in acrylic, away from any harsh lighting, for a bear that was burned and buried and then shipped across the country, he's in pretty good shape.
Right. And maybe this is a bit of a difficult question, but why do you think the story still resonates with people?
Certainly I've been asked that. I think it's it's part of that kind of mystique of the West. He was one of the last grizzly bears in Utah, maybe not the last, but one of the last. And so kind of that turn from the Wild West to kind of more modern times. I think he kind of represents an older age. Maybe even if that historically it was in the 20s, whether that was true or not. But I think the legend around him has been built up so much, especially his size, and this kind of this hunt that Frank Clark had him for over 10 years, and kind of representing the conquering of the West in a way. So I think it's just one of those stories that kind of sticks with people about kind of the changing landscape in the early 1900s.
Well, I think that's all the questions I have. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think I always encourage people, if they want to see the skull, they can always come and see him. You can see the skull anytime the library's open, but if you'd like to come in special collections and kind of see materials, we have 3D prints of the skull that you can pick up and kind of see too. So we're open 10 to 4 Monday through Friday, and we'd love to have you. So this is the skull. It is the original, and as you can see, it's a little hard to see on film, but he's kind of shiny, and so that's that wax resin. When they did an exhibit, I think 2018 or 2017, 2018, they kind of redid this, and so he's in an acrylic vitrine, and then he has an acrylic based, and he's on a steel rod. The gentleman who did this, his name's Stephen Greener. He's our preservation technician, was kind of walking me through his process. And then on the outside, we kind of frame the skull so that if you're on the other side, you can see the tag from the Smithsonian and the number they gave him. And you can kind of see, the char marks too, from when the body was burned. But because we assume because he was Frank Clark, was shooting him multiple times, including in the head, why the skull isn't complete. He was also buried, so the entire thing may not have been recovered with that. But his dimensions, that research center in Montana said, he was probably only 7 feet tall. He was a big bear, certainly, but probably not nearly 10 feet tall. But for what he went through, what he went through, I think the skull's in pretty good condition too.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. So, I'm assuming all the markings on it are from the Smithsonian.
Yeah. So when we got that back in the 70s, they certainly had it on display in the Spectrum in the basketball stadium, and he was taken on a few parades, but because he was on loan at first, just for a year, they didn't want to do anything like permanent to him. But they kept renewing that yearly loan until he's just on a permanent loan. But besides just kind of protecting him from the elements, we haven't done anything to him. So. And yeah, on the tag it says that he was killed in July 1922. But Frank Clark would say later on the 20s it was 1923. So this and that.
And then like the writing on it, is that also Smithsonian?
Yeah. So they kind of did this where they tied two pieces of the skull together, which I assume because it was pretty badly broken when they got it. So that was done too. It's pretty neat to have this kind of piece of Utah history still available. So.